So wrapping up with 4.2, we want to think about the different types of inflation. Now this will actually make a lot of sense if you think back to our supply and demand models that we learned back in Unit 2. If we think about our microeconomic supply and demand model, we say what causes an increase in price? Well, an increase in price could happen with supply and demand due to a shift to the right or an increase in demand, or a shift to the left or a decrease in supply. Well, the same thing can happen on an aggregate level. And so we're going to see the two different types of inflation that we see. One is known as demand pull inflation, which is an increase in demand, or in this case, with our macroeconomic model, an increase in our aggregate demand, meaning that an increase in demand for products as a whole is going to cause the average level of prices to increase. Cost push inflation is caused by a decrease in our aggregate supply curve. Or what we're saying here is that typically, the reason it's called cost push is it typically happens when there's an increase in the price of inputs across the board. Maybe something like oil, which is covers so many different things within the economy. We see that would cause a huge decrease in the total supply of goods and services we can produce, and that's going to cause the price of everything to increase. So again, if we look at this on the models, demand pull inflation can be characterized by an increase in our demand curve. And if you notice at a new equilibrium, that price level has gone up. That's inflation. So the demand has caused inflation to occur. The same thing could be said with cost push inflation. We said that could be because a decrease in our aggregate supply. So maybe the cost of oil does go up, and that, impacts the production of all sorts of plastics and all sorts of transportation and things like that. And so we see a decrease in our aggregate supply curve. Well, at our new equilibrium, our price level has also gone up. So both of these things have caused inflation to occur. Demand pull and cost push are both these shifts of either demand or supply that cause an increase in prices. Now, a few other things for you to know or to be aware of, a couple different other terms you might hear when it comes to inflation. One is known as creeping inflation. In the United States, we typically experience about 1 to 3% inflation annually, and that's actually normal. It's actually a good thing to happen in a growing economy. If you look at the United States' inflation rates, this is from about 1960 until present day, 2020. If you notice, that green section there represents that span from about 1 to 3%. And if you notice, we've historically hung out right about in that range. A few exceptions, obviously, were in the 1970s when we experienced massive inflation, and that lasted a little bit into the 80s. But you saw we slowly got it under control, especially into the 90s. But then we had a little bit of deflation with the Great Recession. If you notice that little bit where it dipped below the black line. But for the most part, it stays right there in about the 1 to 3% inflation. That's normal to have in a growing economy. What we'll actually end up seeing, there's actually typically a direct relationship between GDP growth and the inflation rate. And so what that means is as our economy is growing, we typically see inflation is occurring as well. And so GDP increases, so does inflation. But as GDP decreases, so does inflation. It can lead to possible deflation. And we actually saw that, like I said, it dipped below the black line a little bit. That was actually during the Great Recession because our GDP was decreasing and it led to prices dropping. And we'll talk about why that is later on. But in the 1970s, we saw that huge jump in inflation. And that was actually something that we refer to as stagflation. Because not only did we see inflation, we also saw a stagnant or a non-growing economy. What that means is we were experiencing inflation at the same time as we were experiencing unemployment, or unemployment comes along with a shrink in our GDP. And that goes against those rules we said earlier. We said typically inflation and GDP move in the same direction, but here we're saying inflation is going up and GDP is going down, which leads to more unemployment. So this is kind of weird, but this is what happened in the 1970s, and we're going to talk about why that is later on in Unit 6. And finally, something known as hyperinflation. So hyperinflation is when we see the money supply grows really, really fast. And I mean, kind of the times we think about this is, post World War I Germany. We think about Zimbabwe back in the early 2000s, wherever money supply is growing way too fast. And as people get more and more money, that demand pull inflation kicks in. And since all these people have all sorts of money, they're trying to buy everything. And so that's causing prices to be driven up fast and fast and faster. We saw this happen in Zimbabwe to the point where prices were doubling every about 24 hours and 39 minutes. Absolutely insane. And this is again when the money supply is growing too fast. And this again, we're talking, millions of percent inflation. This is a very rare instance, but it can happen and it has happened in the past.